Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, brakeman in the two-man bobsled that is the contemporary American intellectual scene. My guest on the show this week is Timothy Schenck, assistant professor of history at the George Washington University, and author most recently of Left Adrift, What Happened to Liberal Politics, which I think came out last year, and which I reviewed for Airmail some months back. I'd say 90% positively. I had some quibbles, but mostly liked the book. So both the book and a recent article of Tim's from the Boston Review that we discuss, I would say they fall into the overarching category of why did the left lose its groove and how can the left get its groove back, which is a conversation you'll know if you've been a regular listener that I've had before in various ways from various angles. This one feels a bit different, though, in its focus, not on the kind of the leaders in the party, the people who are in one way or another setting the tone or determining the direction, the activists, the elected officials, the intellectuals, but rather on the people we would need to persuade in order to win, in order to get our groove back. And Tim, who is by training a historian, but in some ways, to me, feels a little bit more like a political scientist, maybe in his temperament, than a historian. He's thought a lot about who these people are, who the swing voter is, who the working class voter is, what it is they want, how they've changed, why they have kind of disaffiliated from the left, and not just from the Democratic Party in the US, but from other kind of working class or once upon a time working class centered parties in places like the UK and South Africa and Israel. He has also thought a lot in very personal ways about how his own politics have changed over the past decade as a writer and as a sometime editor at Dissent magazine. So we have a good, I would say, kind of appealingly idea-dense conversation. Tim is one of those people whose brain moves at a markedly faster pace than my own does, left to its own device. I like to think of myself as a deep, but sometimes relatively slow thinker. I have been around various of these hyper-fast thinking people throughout my life, and I can usually find a new speed when needed, a new gear, which I think I did in this case. You'll have to judge. Before we get to the conversation, one housekeeping note, one random vent. The housekeeping note is just a request to rate me on your podcast distribution platform of choice. I think it matters, and it's not much to ask, particularly if you're not a paid subscriber. You don't even, I think, have to offer a comment. You just have to click the number of stars, obviously 5, and then you're out. So the vent. I was watching the freestyle skiing on the Winter Olympics the other night, and the announcers were making a big deal out of 2022 gold medalist and gold medal contender here in the 2026 Winter Olympics, skier Eileen Gu, during which they mentioned briefly that she was born and raised in the U.S., but skis for China in the Olympics, which I thought was odd enough that I assumed they would soon follow up with a plausible explanation for why she's skiing for our global nemesis. But they didn't. They said something vague and unpersuasive about her wanting to inspire girls, embracing her mixed heritage. Her mom was born in China. But it kind of didn't add up. It clearly didn't add up. So I did what one does in these situations. First, I asked AI, why is Eileen Gu skiing for China? And then I asked Google. And when neither of them gave me satisfying answers, I posted something to social, to Substack Notes, basically to the effect of saying I'm deeply skeptical of why she's skiing for the brutally repressive Chinese regime. I assume there's something opportunistic and grubby in some way in that decision, but maybe I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm right. And then things happen on social media as they do. And the core of the event I want to share isn't really about Gu herself. It turns out she is skiing for China for entirely grubby reasons because they're paying her a shit ton of money. But I don't honestly care that much about that. I'm broadly of the get your money queen school of these things. What bothers me, or maybe I should say what worries me, is the way that a number of people responded on Notes to what I think was rather tame disapproval of Gu. I mean, I really wasn't going after her. I was just like, this seems off. Which is that they viscerally perceived it as a kind of right-coded complaint and reacted to it as such. So the suggestion was that in saying that I was blind to how terribly America is behaving on the world stage right now. You know, who are we to judge China? I think there was a kind of suggestion that I wasn't being sufficiently sensitive to Gu's desire to connect to her ancestral homeland, to lean into her biraciality, her mixed ancestry. One person even got really mad at me when, in the course of our conversation, I linked to an article on the topic by Mike Pesca because it was published in the Free Press. And I guess that alone was so awful because Barry Weiss that the rest of the question was irrelevant. And I should say, it's not that I don't get these reactions. In a sense, I do. We all have our heuristics, and China baiting, red baiting has historically been a right-coded activity. And then from another angle, it does have a slightly icky vibe for a middle-aged white dude to criticize a young biracial woman, even if the middle-aged white dude in question is an obscurity and the young biracial woman is rich and famous and all of that. It's also true that America is kind of a shit show right now. And it's also true that if you look around the web, and it's been a few days since this, and there's been more that's come out about this, you can see that a lot of the criticism of GU is coming from the right. So it makes sense that people respond to it as a kind of right-coded thing. But that said, and I feel this so strongly, by we, I mean kind of those of us on the left side of things, broadly speaking, we have to be able to walk and chew gum and pat our tummies at the same time here. So maybe America sucks right now. It does. I don't feel great about it. I'm happy to write about it. But China really sucks. Like China's a truly awful regime with really nothing to recommend it from a liberal or left-wing perspective. Also, Eileen Gu is beautiful and young and vulnerable in all sorts of ways, I'm sure, but she is also rich and famous, and she can't be above criticism because she mouths girl boss pieties, or because there should be some certain class of people who are prevented from criticizing her when she does dumb or grubby things because of our identity or age or whatever. Like that's not a heuristic ultimately we should be holding if we want to be sort of constructive in our politics. It is the case that J.D. Vance, who's been out there criticizing GU, is a giant steaming pile of bearded, craven putrescence. But just because he says something, it is not incumbent on us to say the opposite. And I guess the other thing, and this is where this all comes from, honestly, is just like if we can't indulge in a bit of us versus them nationalism during the Olympics and wish ill on somebody who sold out our country for some pieces of silver for our enemy country, again, in the drama, the Olympic-style drama of this, then like, who are we? So I don't wish ill on Eileen Gu. I don't want her to lose any endorsements. I don't want her canceled. I definitely don't want her to receive abuse, nasty abuse ad hominem from any corner. I just don't want American broadcasters to shower praise upon her as they have been. I don't want them to give her one of those classic soft focus Olympics personal interest features, which they did. I don't want them to treat her implicitly like one of ours. I want her to be the bad guy in the drama, Cold War style, for a few days, and then she can go back to her fabulous life, to enjoying her fabulous life. And more to the point, I just don't want us to let our beliefs and reactions as people of good conscience and wholesome liberal and left-wing beliefs to be dictated or overly subscribed in what we believe and what we say by a fear of accidentally sounding anything like the right. If we do that, we're just screwed. They exploit all sorts of issues, people, traditions, and impulses in all sorts of ways that don't really cohere at all, except insofar as they present opportunities for them to score cheap political points. It does not make sense to cede all that territory for them. It's too much territory. They don't deserve it. We should say what we believe regardless. So finally, this connects in a very direct way. I realize as I'm saying it to my conversation with Tim, we talk about all sorts of theories for why the left has lost so much support among swing voters and working class voters. I don't feel like I have a brilliant answer any more than anyone else does, either to why that happened or to what we would do to get that support back. But I know what can't possibly work, which is allowing ourselves to define our political identities merely in opposition to the other side. So, all right, vent over. Whew. That felt good. I share it with you so that I don't have to take it out on my family. So that's that. Hope you enjoy the conversation with Tim Schenk. Peace. Tim Schenk, welcome to Eminent Americans. I hereby anoint you an eminent American by the power vested in me by the ghost of Irving Howe, founding spirit, guiding spirit of Dissent Magazine, where you are a maybe senior editor, maybe editor emeritus, whatever we want to call you. You're in the mix there, but you're also a professor. What's your rank? I don't want to overrank.
I'm assistant still, coming up for tenure next year. Fingers crossed.
Okay. Assistant professor of government, political science, history? History. Okay. At the George Washington University, not George Washington University, but the George Washington.
I go rogue. I never add the. We're not Ohio State, or we're not the Ohio State, but I suppose that's like what we're supposed to do.
I'm in tune to that because my day job is at UT Austin. So it's always the University of Texas at Austin.
And not that other one.
Not that other one, which has taken a really sad turn. I have a kind of interesting story about that, which maybe we'll get to if it comes to it. I mean, I think I asked you on the show, and it's interesting because I have a whole bunch of different things. I wrote a review of your most recent book, Left Adrift. We have that to talk about, which I think is really interesting. You also directed me to this piece, your response to a longer piece in Boston Review, Whither the Democrats, essentially, like how to win again. And that touches on a lot of the stuff you do. And then we were talking a little bit before we started recording about broadly the state of the left. Maybe, I think implicitly, you didn't use the word woke. I think you were talking about the kind of whither the millennial left and sort of the degree to which it was possible or was not possible to kind of integrate old school dissent style leftism with more sort of racially oriented, maybe gender oriented, modern millennial left. So all of these things, but maybe where I want to start is, because I read it this morning, because you sent it to me, was this Boston Review piece and your response to it. I'm trying to think of what the title, do you have the title in front of you?
It is the piece that has been done, many versions of, which is not to criticize either the piece or Boston Review, but the latest version of the Whither Democrats. This one is called How Not to Defeat Authoritarianism.
This is one of these Boston Review symposiums where there's a long main piece and then they solicit responses from a bunch of people. The main piece
is... So many people. They did a fantastic job just gathering this roster together.
I'm not trying to pronounce his last name. Adam Bonica, who I think is from Stanford, and then Jake Grumbach, who is from another university.
Berkeley, I think. The West Coast Mafia, yeah.
West Coast Mafia. So, I mean, do you want to describe it? Maybe describe what the piece's argument is and then your response to it, your frustration with it. And I think I had maybe a different frustration with it than you did, but let's talk it through and then we'll get...
Well, it does link up, and I will display my Eminent Americans Oppenheimer fanboy cred here. It links up with the pre-existing concern of Whither Matt Yglesias and the left's relationship there too. Because the piece is really, it's not a polemic, but it is a sustained attack on popularism. And it really is popularism as promulgated by Matt Yglesias. And it's really useful because Bonica and Grumbach, these political scientists, Grumbach in particular has a vigorous presence on social media. And it's really helpful to have the sustained, serious version of their case against this version of popularism, which, as I'm sure 99% of the people listening to this podcast are already familiar with. The core of the idea, as expressed by Yglesias, who coined the term, or David Shor, who's probably its most prominent practitioner as this democratic political data guru. The short version of it is Democrats should say and do popular things and not do unpopular things. And that if they say things that people believe, that people will also be more likely to vote for them, and that this is a good way to defeat Republicans. And the central element of the Grumbach piece, or what they spend a lot of their time on, is developing the statistical case that the benefits of moderation have plummeted over the last generation or so. And that, yes, once upon a time, politicians might have been able to win votes by moving to the center. But if you look at House elections, those effects are just swamped by so many other factors. And that it's better as a consequence. One of my favorite parts of the essay was just the humility, which is always good. It's a virtue to have in these conversations. But they say, acknowledging that nobody knows the answer for certain, we think that the path forward for Democrats would involve less of, not just is it popularism, saying do popular things, but this version of populism is moderate the party. Move to the center on economics, move to the center on the culture war, a across-the-board attempt to shift the position of the Democratic Party. This is their gloss on popularism.
Right. That's not their argument, but that's what they're saying essentially, that Yglesias, Shor...
Yes, and they are rejecting that because they say, in fact, taking these issue positions isn't going to give Democrats the political benefit that Shor and Yglesias say. What will? Well, we don't know for certain, they argue, but some combination of anti-corruption, running on an anti-corruption platform and crusading against gerontocracy, and also recruiting working class candidates and just having a kind of fun anti-establishment vibe. It seems like if you put those pieces together, that's what you get. And one part of the story that they also have in the back of their mind is an argument about democracy itself, which is, and especially about the place of voters, and they're building on this literature in political science. Larry Bartels, Christopher Aiken have this book, Democracy for Realists, that elaborates the argument at greater length, which just says, like, listen, voters, they don't have coherent worldviews. They don't pay attention to this stuff with all that much rigor. Like, sure, yeah, there are some ideologues on one side or the other, this hobbyist class, but most people, they don't care that much. They're just tuning in. The line I always have for this, which I feel like Eminent Americans is the place to use this, that most people know as much about politics as Ezra Klein does about football. That just live in that world and accept that they're voting based on vibes and maybe the state of the economy. And even then, that's kind of shaky. So you just don't have to worry about targeting the center because that's a myth. It doesn't exist and voters don't care about issues anymore. But if you're able to cultivate this anti-establishment vibe by the anti-corruption platform, running against gerontocracy, working class candidates, then the problem is solved. And that is as I understand it, the sort of overall thrust of the piece.
So Iglesias did respond, which I thought was nice. I was kind of surprised by that, but they got Iglesias to respond. And then you responded, and a whole bunch of other people too. I just read you and Iglesias and maybe one or two other people. The piece, I should say, is very wonky, right? And it was essentially like, as you said, there used to be a clear in the sort of data electoral advantage to running as a moderate that has essentially disappeared. Iglesias' response was primarily, well, a lot rides on what you mean by essentially, right? He's saying like, well, if you look at the data, even the data that you share, what you're actually seeing is a 1 or 2% electoral boost for moderates, and that actually can be determinative in a lot of elections. And so that on that alone makes the case essentially for my popularism. You had a different approach. I think your frustration had more to do with their kind of implicit or explicit model of voters and sort of what the party's orientation towards them should be. I mean, do you want to articulate that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think that this is a nice case where there's a kind of abstract, theoretical, political, philosophical objection to it that also links up with a concrete analysis of how Democrats got here and what they should do next. So I think all of those pieces are connected. And where I get off the bus with this argument, and it was probably evident from my maybe too snarky summary of it, is what I see as a far too dismissive attitude toward voters and how they make decisions. This notion that ordinary people, again, that they're not paying attention. Yes, that's true. They're not versed in the details of policy platforms. Like, yes, that is also true. They don't have coherent ideological worldviews. Like, yes, for most people, that's true. But they still have positions. They still have issues that they believe that matter to them. And a lot of those issues do involve kitchen table politics, which is one just practical element of what I object to in the piece. And I would also recommend, always in addition to my response, there's a really thoughtful reply from two of the folks at the Center for Working Class Politics, the Jacobin-affiliated research center, as Jared Abbott and one other person. And they've done really fantastic work just asking seriously, what do working class voters who used to support the Democratic Party and have drifted away over the last 50 years from the broader perspective and over the last 10 years in particular, what do they care about and why? And the Grumbach-Bonica interpretation of voters who are just moving with vibes, to me, that would make a lot more sense if swings between elections were uniform. If everybody moved in the same way up and down the income scale, across ideology, if everyone's just moving together. But the fact that over the last 50-odd years, working class voters have generally moved right, not just in the United States, but across much of the world, that more affluent, educated voters have moved left. It says, like, yes, in the short term, who wins or loses an election has a lot to do with vibes and also, say, the economy. But these longer-term coalition shifts suggest to me that it can't just be everyone equally responding to these incentives because they're different. And the fact is that you see this playing out not just over the long run, but from election to election. There are all of these cases you can point to where different candidates running on different platforms build different coalitions. And that's because I think that ordinary people are smarter than Grumbach and Bonica give them credit for. That they, again, it's not that they are coherent liberals and conservatives, but they know what they feel about immigration, for instance. And it's also not to say that their position on immigration, it could change down the road in response to events. That is completely true. But as someone who, for instance, my case, and this is an unrepresentative example for lots of reasons, my mom is a diehard Trump supporter. I have tried for a very, very long time to persuade her that is wrong. I have failed in that project. And if I cannot, over decades, persuade my mom not to be a Republican anymore, how exactly is Democratic candidate X supposed to talk person they've never met into having a fundamentally different view of immigration in 6 weeks? Like, it's just going to be really hard. And again, persuasion is possible, but it's a long-term game. And I think having a kind of baseline respect for voters and the views that they have, which I will say for all the faults that one could point to for the Democratic consulting class, I think the best of them do have that respect. It's one reason why I wrote Left Adrift is it turned out that when I spent just even a little bit of time, a cursory examination of some Clinton era political strategists, they were so much smarter, so much more sophisticated than I had given them credit for. And so that's phase one. I think they get voters wrong. Because they get voters wrong, they just do not, it was striking to me in Boston Review, this left liberal publication, these two left liberal scholars, not talking at all about this question of class de-alignment and not talking about this transformation of the Democratic coalition, like just focusing on this particular issue of Democratic and Republican House candidates and the benefits of moderation. And that gets to another problem, which is like, yes, I'm happy to grant that there's only so much a House candidate can do in an increasingly polarized, nationalized political climate. But look at how Donald Trump has changed the image of the Republican Party in the last 10 years, and look how the coalitions have changed as a consequence. It shows me that people are paying attention and that a large-scale attempt to shift the party image, that can change something. And this leads to because I have a different view of voters and their relative capacity for making decisions, because I pay more attention or care more about, based on just what we spend our time talking about, this question of class de-alignment and its influence on the Democratic Party. I also have this is just something that comes up when you ask ordinary people what they care about, sort of economic pocketbook issues, which they, in addition to not discussing de-alignment, they push those pocketbook questions to the side because they associate that with moderation. And my response would be like, listen, I am not recommending a full-bore tilt to the center on all fronts, but some version of an economically populist campaign that raises the salience of those economic issues, that has to be accompanied also by picking your battles wisely in the culture war and respecting that even if you want to persuade people over the long run, as you should, you got to pick and choose your battles now. That Barack Obama is not coming out in favor of gay marriage in 2008. He's waiting to do that on his own timeline because he wants this important thing to do first, which is winning the election. I think this is just how politics and democracy should work, that it has to, in some sense, be a machine for turning public opinion into public policy, and that a combination of a baseline respect for what voters believe, a commitment to improving their daily lives, and a faith that persuasion could work over the long run is a much better attitude for the Democratic Party than just, I'm not saying that Bonica and Grumback agree with this, but there is, the crudest version of this thesis would be a kind of jangling car keys view of the electorate that says these are a bunch of babies who will distract, we'll shake this in front of their face, they'll pay attention, then we'll just go in power and do whatever we want.
I want to say this about your book, your recent book, before I kind of get to question, which is a little bit away from it. One of the things that was so striking about your book, which is that it's not just following kind of realignment over time in the U.S., it's following realignment over time in, where else? Israel, South Africa, is it those three?
And the UK.
And the UK. That's right. So you have four very, very different contexts, very, very different party structures, very, very different histories and cultures. And what's so striking about this is there's similar kinds of realignments, or at least movements away from the successful sort of class-oriented, working class, labor, democratic, socialist in South Africa, socialist-esque in Israel. And you see this similar trend, and you're like, well, at that point, you just have to recognize, you just have to grant some sort of underlying reality in the sort of shift in voter preference over the long course of the 20th into the 21st century. So I want to say that as a kind of background, but I want to get to something much more lower level in a sense, which is what is our respective kind of model of voters, right? You know, on the one hand, you can say, okay, well, and again, we realize we're sort of caricaturing Bonica and Grumback in a sense, which is just they're incoherent, they're susceptible to influence and manipulation, they're basically a bunch of babies. That's not really what they're saying, but it's a way of interpreting that kind of ideological incoherence as kind of a fundamental lack of structure. At the same time, there is a lot of incoherence, right? You do realize when you talk to like a normie person who's not into politics, they believe all sorts of shit that doesn't align with the parties, right? They believe that like lizard people are sort of running the country, as well as they believe that like the minimum wage should be $20, and they believe we should be more restrictionist on immigration, and they believe in astrology. And like, well, you know, how do you think about who the voter is? And another thing that I believe very deeply, and I don't know how to integrate with this, but this I believe this of everyone, including the people who are sort of more ideologically coherent, which is that like there's all sorts of like unconscious psychological shit going on too. Like, I don't think it makes sense to talk about MAGA, to talk about the history of conservatism in America without talking about all sorts of crazy, dark racial shit, for instance, right? That if you really want to understand it at a kind of profound level, you have to get into people like Freud or Jung or Weber or Marx or things like that. And so for me, I don't have a coherent sense of what the voter is. I agree with you. There are such a thing as real interests. There are real beliefs that politicians would be wise to attend to, but that's different from saying that it's all operating in a sort of conscious, well aligned with people's interests structure, and there's nothing to ideas of, whether it's a psychoanalytic interpretation or a Marxist notion of false consciousness or anything like that. You're the political scientist in a sense. You're a historian, but you're closer to a political scientist than I am. Do you have a coherent sense in your mind of who voters are?
Yes. And so let's break this into two parts. Let's talk about swing voters, who are the folks who are out for grabs, how you build that coalition, and then let's talk about the psychology question, because I think they're both important, but one sets up the other. So we'll talk about who's up for grabs and then what's motivating them. So my short take on American political history, and we'll just focus on the United States for purposes of this question. So big picture, the transformation of American politics over the last 70 years is Republicans and Democrats going from the party of the Chamber of Commerce versus the AFL-CIO to the party of Fox News and MSNBC. And it's like down the road toward like TikTok and whatever dark future that's bringing us. And it's like, of course, like there are affinities between that Chamber of Commerce and Fox News party, just as there are affinities between the AFL-CIO and I guess the MS Now party. But there are also profound differences along the way. And you can see the sort of declining salience of those economic issues, a rising importance of a bunch of culturally progressive issues, education polarization, all that stuff jumping into the mix. And one thing that happens too is that within the parties, Democrats become this much more consistently liberal party, and Republicans become this much more consistently conservative party. So and this is a chart, one of those charts that circulated a lot.
That sort of blue and red chart of like
the four quadrants, right? There is the liberal quadrant in one corner, the consistent liberal group. And it goes back to Lee Drutman, Patrick Ruffini and his consulting firm Echelon Insights just had a version of it where you have some ideological test and you put voters, Americans, into the boxes. There's a lot of people in the consistently liberal quadrant where they are both economic and cultural progressives. There's a lot of conservatives in the consistent conservatives, economic and cultural conservatives. I think Ruffini's the numbers that's freshest in my mind. And I think it's something like, somewhat surprisingly, about 40% in this Republican pollsters evaluation, about 40% of Americans are consistent liberals. About 30% are in the consistent conservative box. And then the question is, all right, the cross-pressured voters, the people who are combinations of perspectives, those are the ones who in an ideologically polarized system are going to be up for grabs. So there are the neoliberal, cultural progressives, and economic conservatives. That's one corner. And then there's the populists. For lack of a better term, the populists, culturally conservative, economically progressive. And according to Ruffini and Drutman, this has been replicated time and again, maybe 5% of the country is in the neoliberal box, and about 25% of the country is in the populist box. So there's no single voter that's up for grabs, but because there are these two broadly competing types. And the reason why Republicans have been doing better in the Trump era is that they've been posting major gains with the populist corner, while Democrats' biggest advances have been with the neoliberals.
So we're talking, just to put a face on this, we're talking about some middle American, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio voter who back in the day would have been a solid Democrat when the Democrats were more aligned with kind of union workers or something. Maybe they or their father worked in an auto plant, and they voted for Clinton, then they voted for Bush, then they voted for Obama, then they voted for Trump, then they maybe voted a little bit, they cut a little bit for Biden, and then they voted for Trump again. Something like that?
Yeah, and the one thing is that this goes back a long way. So political analysts Richard Scammon, Ben Wanenberg in 1970, they have this book, The Real Majority, and they say the swing voter in American politics, and it's a response to Kevin Phillips and this discourse around the Southern strategy and realignment. And they're like, the swing voter in American politics is not a KKK member in Alabama. The swing voter in American politics is, the exact language is something like a machinist housewife in Dayton, Ohio. That's the person you're trying to bring. And the thing is that Kevin Phillips knows this. And he says, listen, if Republicans win the solid South and lose the rest of the country, then we are going to lose elections. This is not a strategy. This tiny historian's complaint of mine is what's often referred to as the Southern strategy. I think it's much better referred to as a Northern strategy. As in, Kevin Phillips wants to isolate the Democrats to the Northeast. He wants Democrats to be this alliance between Harlem and Harvard, and he wants the rest of the country in the Republican camp. And this gets to sort of the enduring strength of right-wing populists and how these arguments have been around with us for a long, long time. But yeah, that your baseline voter, and again, they're not reading Jacobin, they're not consistent economic progressives, and they're also not climate change is a defining issue of our time. But they have a general sense that the system is rigged, they would like their life to be easier, and that what is you see, especially common trope, is that it's a conspiracy of the top and the bottom against the middle. That they're the rich people out there who have their fancy accountants, so they don't pay any taxes. They're not carrying their fair share. And there's these people at the bottom who they get welfare. They're piggybacking off the rest of us. And we are the people who are carrying society on our shoulders and not being rewarded for it.
So there's a racial tinge to it.
Oh, often explicit, and this in Left
It's not
Drift.
impermeable. It's not determinative or something. Like it's like, in the language of like affirmative action, it's like a plus factor, right?
And this is fantastic. And this is the grandparents of these people, the ancestors. Those are people who I guarantee you are much more culturally conservative who happily voted for FDR. All right. So just like the fact is, if you were trying to recruit these people into a broad progressive agenda, it was done in the past. And the question is just what issues are you putting on the table and saying these are the things that matter? And down to George Packer has this really fascinating piece from right before Obama's elected in like 2008. And I forget where he's going. It might be West Virginia. And I think he might be like knocking door to door, asking people how they're going to vote. Maybe it's Ohio, because West Virginia definitely not going for Obama in 2008 or ever. But here's someone who there's going with an Obama recruiter or something. They knock at the door and a guy or woman opens the door and they're like, oh, who are you going to vote for? And they might call back. It's like, who's the insert N word here? That guy. And there are people who in 2008 are like, would be off the charts on any racial resentment scale, but they're pissed off about the George W. Bush and the financial crash. And so they're going to vote for Barack Obama, who in 2008 does put together a coalition that, minus the weakness in the South and noting that, yes, he did better than Democrats had historically in suburbs, it still looks fundamentally like that New Deal coalition, where Democrats do best with voters at the bottom scale.
So your model, you think there actually is a sort of coherent, maybe ideology is the wrong word, but there's a kind of coherent political identity of this moderate, which is like somewhat economically populist, somewhat culturally conservative, maybe a little racist, but like not so racist that if somebody like Obama seems like he's representing the kind of other parts of their identity sufficiently, that they won't vote for him or something like that.
From the New Deal coalition down to 2008, it was possible to get those people within a broadly progressive camp. Not all the time, not with this sort of reliable consistency, but it did happen. And this is the thing that you have to put alongside the fact that, yes, this realignments, some version of this realignment has taken place, not everywhere, but in a lot of countries, which says there's something structural here. That is true. It is also true that election by election, the results can vary a lot. The candidates matter, the issues they put forward matter, all of that stuff counts too, which is why you have to just keep in your head both at the same time. There are these structural factors pushing toward a Brahmin left, populist right coalition at the same time that candidates, campaigns, parties do have real influence. And I want to say again that there is another camp of voters out there too. The approaches you could have is like, number one, let's try and get this big group of populists on our side. That's one strategy. Number two, you could say, or we can try and squeak through with those neoliberals and that let's double down, try and turn them out. They have more money. They're more consistent voters. Maybe they're being undercounted by Drutman, Ruffini, whoever. Or you could say, let's just try and make more liberals. Or they either persuade more liberals or just do turnout. And this was a very frustrating thing for me to see in some of the responses to the piece was people saying, oh, we'll just do turnout. And that works sometimes, especially in midterms. It's a lot harder to do in a national election. And a point that Grumbach and Bonica make in the piece is that by the best estimates that we have available, we're never going to know this for certain, but the best political scientists have been able to come up with says that if 100% of voters turned out in 2024, Trump probably would have won by at least a little bit more.
When people on the Democratic side are saying do turnout, are they meaning one of the other of these things or both of these things? They're meaning turnout of the base, so the people who are sort of consistently, in that quadrant where they're economically and culturally liberal, or they mean turnout of that 5% neoliberal.
It's the base. And this is one reason why Bonica and Grumbach are liked in that kind of blue sky left, is that an implication of their analysis, and something that they argue explicitly, is that Democrats need to do more base mobilization. And if persuasion doesn't work, then they have what I think is a basically, to my mind, unpersuasive account of every election for the last 20 odd years being determined by which party is better at turning out the base. And that there are these, whether it's getting your consistent partisans out to the polls, or maybe there's this hidden reservoir of liberal progressive voters out there who are just waiting for Jesse Jackson 2.0 to mobilize them. And there was a version of the strategy that I bought until Bernie Sanders tried it in 2020 and it blew up in his face. One issue, so there are cases where mobilization works. There are elections that have been won that way, and it's especially possible in midterms. But the tricky thing with turnout, especially in a national election, is if you're going to say, I can mobilize the base with a bold progressive message, you got to explain to me how you're not going to mobilize the other side in response, right? You have to pull off this, for the progressive version of this case to work, it's getting Democrats and these potential liberals out there so madly excited for your candidate while conservatives don't respond at all. And I can just imagine in a sort of a Jesse Jackson style, like 2.0 candidate, maybe it turns out Democrats in huge numbers, but Republicans get to vote too, and Republicans get to have a response. And It turns out actually that a person who was good at doing a version of this base mobilization strategy was Trump in 2016, where he did turn out Republicans, but he also got enough of those, or blue collar, especially blue collar whites, to show up for him. And Democrats, especially black voters, didn't turn out in the numbers that Hillary Clinton needed. But it is still a very, very hard strategy to pull off, with a basic objection that, at least in the responses to this forum, just were not even acknowledged.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what the different kind of strategies are, right? So I think the Iglesias one, and I actually need to figure out kind of where he stands on this versus where my sort of desired version of him stands on this. But like, let's say the simplistic Iglesias version is run on moderate issues. You'll win enough of a percentage of these people you're talking about, the what is it, the wife of a machinist from Ohio or something, or her granddaughter, that you'll win, right? So that's the sort of, you won't do amazingly well kind of turning out the base because you won't necessarily excite them with your, whether it's a kind of left-wing agenda or it's a more sort of emotionally populist agenda or something like that. So that's the kind of Iglesias version. I think the kind of the Bonica, maybe the simplistic Bonica-Grumbach version is what you're saying Trump did in 2016 and 2024, which is somehow at the same time red meat to the base, drive mobilization without alienating the middle of the road people or turning out the liberals by really pissing them off or something.
And
like
this
that.
is a point where that might sound like an insane interpretation of the election to people listening to this. And there was an argument that was, it's in my head because I was reading these responses just yesterday and was striking to see me come up. Their version of Donald Trump is, this is a guy who ticked every box on the right-wing wish list, and he is proof that extremism can win. That one, I don't think Bonica and Grumbach necessarily made this argument. Actually, no, they did in their response to the piece, I think. But it's like, if Trump can move to the right consistently on all these issues and win, then that shows that moderation is a waste of time. I have a different reading of Trump, and I think it's one that's backed up by the data. It's backed up by even.
I've seen Iglesias say this too, which is right. He moderated on all these issues, right?
He did ramp up the salience of these cultural issues. Obviously, took an extreme position on issues like immigration, but he also attacked at the center on questions like Social Security, even on healthcare. He's like, we're going to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something way better, and I'm going to get prices lower. I'm going to deliver on your material concerns. And if you listen to focus groups, which they're not scientifically representative, but I do think they tell you something useful and qualitative, there are a lot of voters who say, oh, he's a business guy. He cares about getting deals. He's not one of those normal politicians, and he's going to focus on getting good deals for us.
Maybe it's a more intuitive case, actually, to at least to people on the left, to think of Obama in that light, right? Mm-hmm. But Obama was somebody who had the capacity to absolutely mobilize the base, right? And then this big constituency of black voters who are not uniformly liberal, and at the same time seemed to be able to, maybe he drove opposition on the right, but also seemed to be appealing. He seemed to be able to mobilize the base without alienating the middle.
Yeah, and the retconning that's happened around Obama is that in retrospect, it seems as if, well, that was obvious. Like Obama, he ran as, I'm a progressive champion on these cultural issues and economics, whatever. That's not how he campaigned. It's definitely not how he campaigned in 2008, because he didn't have to do a lot of work to put economics on the agenda. He did, but post Lehman Brothers collapse, that was an election that was decided by the financial crash. What's most revealing is 2012. That's when he's running for re-election. He doesn't have the economy on this side, facing stiff headwinds. What is he going to do? And there's this amazing moment in David Axelrod, chief strategist for Obama's 2012 campaign, where he describes this 2011-ish, 2010-ish, in Obama's first term. Obama's frustrated. He sort of blows up at his team. And he says, I feel like the presidency's adrift. I'm sinking in the polls. I don't like where things are going. And Axelrod says, okay, Mr. President, write down, let's have a conversation about this. Write down like all the problems that you think we're facing. And Obama comes in the next day with this yellow legal pad filled with the stuff that we're doing wrong. He's like, gay marriage, I'm not making any moves there. Torture, that's still going on. Poverty, we're not doing anything. Climate change, we're not addressing in the way that we should. And in Axelrod's retelling, he and the staff say, like, Mr. President, we agree completely. These are all important issues we need to make progress on. But if you want to win re-election, you need to shut up about those for the next 2 years and campaign as the champion of a beleaguered middle class against Republicans who are vultures, capitalists, like circling the country with a hungry glint in their eye. And that economic populist message is absolutely key to Obama's strategy. My favorite illustration of this is an ad the campaign runs in Ohio in the closing days of the election, where it's Mitt Romney. He's the Bane. He's not Mitt Romney, the creepy Mormon who wants to send us back to the 50s. That's an element. But the ad that's running in Ohio is Mitt Romney, the Bane private equity ghoul who is going to destroy your life like he destroyed the lives of the people who he touched when he was in business. And the tagline for the ad is, Mitt Romney, not one of us. What is the message that allows Barack Hussein Obama to say Mitt Romney, not one of us? It's that economic populist message, and that's why he wins in 2012.
Yeah. It's interesting that in some ways you're aligned with Iglesias, because my assumption is that you are sort of, in terms of your policy preferences, substantially to the left of him. Maybe the distinction would come down to what you both mean by sort of pocketbook issues.
I just think that economic populism has more juice than he allows. And this is why I think if you look at those Center for Working Class Politics people, I really admire that they've done the work of just digging into data, putting together focus groups and surveys, just trying to figure out what people actually think. And they're not saying that, again, that the Jacobin line is what's going to move people across the board. But I take it seriously when they say that there is room for an economic populist candidate out there. And there are instances like this is talked about a lot. I read a piece about this not too long ago, like Dan Osborne, the independent candidate running in Nebraska who outperformed basically everyone else in the election in 2024 relative to expectations, precisely on this economic populist, more culturally moderate platform. And I will say Iglesias, in his response to my piece, said he thought it was like underselling like the pain points. One, I think we disagree about the juice for economic populism, possibly. And he would rather that I foreground sort of the cultural compromises that have to be made by progressives. And I think that's misguided for a few different reasons. But that was his objection. I will say that some people in Osborne's camp reached out to me afterward and they're like, yep, that's like what you said in the piece, like that is the thing that we are doing.
So you wrote a book before Left Adrift. You wrote a book on, what's it called? Realigners?
Realigners, yeah.
Essentially political figures, some of them elected officials, some of them thought leaders or movement leaders or things like that, who had an influence on and came to embody different ways in which there were actual genuine realignment. So this is the kind of middle ground between respecting voters as having beliefs that are real and not just sort of, utterly manipulable by
ideas without ideology.
Right. Ideas without ideology, right? So it's the middle ground between that and also a sort of belief. And I think this is where Iglesias often kind of thin, a belief that actually leadership and movements can change people's perspectives over time, right? I do want to go to that and think about that. And think about that, what the distinction might be between a candidate, a kind of Iglesias, out of the Iglesias factory candidate, which is maybe like somebody like Josh Shapiro or something like that, let's say, right? Not particularly inspiring, or maybe even Gavin Newsom in a sense, like very opportunistic, very willing to kind of throw people under the bus if necessary, de-emphasize culture issues, maybe stake out some heterodox stands on those things, and then just hit the pocketbook stuff over and over again. It's kind of Biden 2020. That's a template for winning some of these elections in a sort of profoundly divided society where no national party is winning landslides, essentially, versus a sort of realigner, versus somebody who comes in or a perspective that comes in and ascends in sort of influence and dominance that actually creates a sustained political realignment that can move the whole map of what's possible policy-wise and what the electorate looks like and what our politics look like. So I want to get to that in a second. That's a little foreshadowing. I think before we get to that, I'm interested in what you said about how Iglesias, and I guess this was in response to your earlier, not your response on this, but an op-ed you wrote. Iglesias thinks that you don't sufficiently emphasize the sort of cultural issues and the necessity of compromising, because that's the background to a lot of what we're talking about that we actually haven't addressed much, right? One of the big things that Iglesias believes, and I think probably Ezra Klein believes in a lot of the, and David Shore, is essentially, I was going to say shut up about the trans stuff, but it's actually a little bit more than shut up about the trans stuff. It's like the race stuff, the abolish the police stuff. It's actually stake out some sort of contrary positions on that.
Yeah, and I would say too, the sort of even one notch further, there is this approach, which is I think of either sort of like fork in the eye moderation, a just sort of a politics of constant sister soldier moments. Right. You need to, it's not just shut up about it. It's move to the center on those issues and pick fights within your party to prove and to let everyone know that you have changed your position on this and that the party is different as a consequence.
Right. And so your perspective, I'm assuming from what you just said, is you don't need to do that. It's more of a shut up about those things, lower the salience of them. You don't need to pick these strategic fights and just hammer home the economic, populist, pocketbook, lunchbox issues.
Not entirely. And this is where, in the response to the piece, I'm sure this is the type of argument that would make an empirically minded political scientist vomit with rage. But I say just ask yourself, if there's a candidate who's asking for your vote and they're like, listen, Dan, you're like, I'll be honest with you. I absolutely hate gay people. Cannot stand gay people at all. Just absolutely despise them. But don't worry about that. Don't you want to tax rich people some more? Don't you want to tax rich people? And maybe you would say like, okay, well, it's like, I really do want to tax rich people, but it'd be a lot easier for me to vote for you if you were not like not even leading with homophobia. But if I, like, let's say they don't lead with homophobia, but you know enough about this person. They're like, listen, hey, Dan, like, we want to tax from rich people. And you're like, but what about the homophobia? It's like, oh, don't worry about that, Dan. Let's go back to the rich people. Like, I'd be furious. I'd be absolutely furious if someone's just trying to change the topic. And this is getting back to like the other side of the view of voters as like babies who we can distract with jangling car keys. It's like, no, voters have object permanence. They know that this other thing is out there. And so there's a degree to which, but on the other hand, this is the Barack Obama, it is clear that he was not saying in 2008, yes, we need a constitutional amendment banning gay marriage, as George W. Bush had 4 years earlier. I think that there is, because a lot of people, the flip side of them not being sort of consistent economic populists, they're not consistent cultural moderates either. It's just that I think progressives should not be surprised when the median position on a lot of cultural issues is more conservative than they would like, because the point of being a progressive is that you're on the vanguard of these changes. You're pushing to change people's mind. So it's just going to take time to catch up. So I think you take a broadly progressive stance on cultural issues, but I think that there are like room on some instances to moderate. It's always a question of picking and choosing. But an objection that I have to the Iglesias fork in the eye approach, the Sister Souljah, is I think the problem that runs into, and this is something, it's a point that Bonnach and Grumbach make, and that there is a political science literature on. If you look at, say, for instance, Keir Starmer in the UK, someone who has run what could say is like broadly this populist platform and who is just is toxically unpopular in the UK right now. And he's not just has he moved to the center on immigration, he's like gives these speeches talking about how we were moving to the center of immigration. He's just making it a clear point. And the response from consistent ideologues of either side, this is Ronald Reagan in the 1970s, and it's progressives today saying, no, if you run, or it's Phil Schlafly saying a choice, not an echo. If you're a Democrat and you run as a moderate, well, people, if they want a conservative, they'll vote for the real conservative. They care about authenticity. And the flip side is like what Republicans will say, if they want a liberal, they'll vote for a real liberal, that people respond to like authentically held convictions. And you just need to run someone who's consistent and they'll respect that. And there will be some people who do that. But I think the problem that the Sister Souljah moment strategy runs into is that the point is not, it's not a question about what positions you're taking, it's about what issues you're moving into the foreground. And I think the problem that like a Starmer runs into is that he makes it seem as if the purpose of voting for labor is to do immigration. And I don't think that you run an extremist and there's no cost to it. But I do think that if you were saying just time and again, the thing that really matters to me as a progressive politician is cracking down on immigration, you are raising the salience of the great issue from the other side and sort of you're conceding the advantage to them. I think the smarter move is instead of the fork in the eye moderation approach where you're just talking about the other side's biggest strength constantly in an attempt to reduce it, is to just sort of quietly but decisively move to the center. And this is like the maximally effective. This is Zohran Mamdani. He is clearly the more sort of like sympathetic to progressives on law and order issues, but he deep sixes his like any talk about defund the police. He repudiates that, but he doesn't go around giving speeches saying, I was wrong to do defund the police. He says, I'm here for affordability. That is the thing that matters. And we are not going to do defund. Similarly, Trump in 2024, he doesn't go around giving speeches saying Republicans need to move to the center on abortion. He just says, we are not going to have a national abortion ban. This is done. It's at the state level. And now let's talk about immigration. Let's talk about the stuff that's my strength. So I think that's the more effective policy, is figuring out what is the broadly progressive position that you can defend with the actually existing electorate, moving there, and then leaning into your strength on economic issues.
You know, I'm trying to draw a distinction between like what a specific candidate should do, where I hear you, and I think what's kind of implicit or explicit in a lot of this, which is changing the culture of the party, right? Because one of the questions of like authenticity, which, as you said, like voters have object permanence. They both recognize what you said that they disagree with, but they also recognize what you're saying that seems kind of opportunistic and doesn't seem, and this is what I think, you could argue that Kamala Harris ran into, which is, right, and this is what, Bonnach and Grumbach say, she ran this moderate campaign and it was a big loser. But the problem is people didn't believe her. I mean, that was a problem, right? She had all of these other positions on the record, which the Republican Party did what seemed like a very good job highlighting, that she probably didn't believe either, but it's like what you end up with is somebody who just doesn't, you're not sure what they believe, right? And so part of what the Iglesias, the Kleins, whomever else are trying to do is they're trying to shift the culture of the party, both shift what people actually believe, but also like, what's the term, like, initiate a preference cascade, right? That there were a lot of people in the Democratic Party who were not on board with these more far left positions that were sort of brought into prominence during, from 2015 to 2023 or something like that. But they kept their mouth shut because there was an internal political price to be paid for disagreeing, right? And so part of what they're doing is trying to kind of let people know this is not what everybody believes. This is not what the median Democrat believes. Empower the people who already don't believe those things to be more outspoken about it, right? Or at least not to say the opposite, right? And so I hear you on the sort of, it doesn't make sense for Josh Shapiro or Gavin Newsom or whomever to run around raising the salience of things that actually the conservatives have strength on in order to establish their independence from the party. But it does make sense, I would say, for Iglesias and Klein and whomever else to sort of try and shift the culture of the party, both so that people who already believe these things are empowered to just be more authentic about their beliefs, right, when it comes up. Maybe it's not picking a ton of sister soldier fights, but maybe it's picking an occasional one just to signal that. But it also has to do with candidate recruitment and who is elevated at different points, right? So people know, if you're looking for the Dan Osborne or for the, I don't know Graham Plattner's politics. Like if you're looking,
because he's more culturally, well, one thing is he's running in Maine, so Maine is not Nebraska, but he's a more progressive candidate on cultural issues and leaning into economic populism.
If you're looking for more Dan Osbornes, there's more space for them in the party where he doesn't have to you just know he doesn't hate gay people, but it's probably not also what, fighting for gay rights or trans rights is not what floats his boat.
And he says, he tries a version of this where it is sort of moderation on those issues and just saying, that's not what I'm here for. Ultimately, I'm here because billionaires have too much influence in politics.
A question I have for you, that was a lot of me kind of opinioning, but a question I have for you, and I'm sure this came up in some of the responses that I didn't read, which is, even if you grant that, like Grumbach and Bonica said, that the party is so nationalized that running as an individual moderate in a specific place is not going to earn you that much of a boost, you still go to the question of, okay, but the party is nationalized. If the party has this reputation as more out there on cultural issues, that's just going to hurt everybody equally, right? And so then the question is just shifting where the kind of locus of shift needs to occur. If you believe that it's taking a hit on these cultural issues, which viscerally I do, right?
Yeah. Their position is that the story of American politics in the last 20, 30 years is stasis, that we're just stuck and we just keep batting each other's heads. And there's a way in which
that's not your story.
Well, it's both. And okay. This is sort of the motivating argument behind, or the starting point for Realigners is this question of majority building. And it begins with just the weird fact that for 60 years now, there's been no stable majority in American politics. And there was a long time, roughly, at the very least, 1890s down to 1960s, when there was one party with a firm majority. So why can't we get these firm majorities that the system really needs in order to work? So I grant the point that if you look on the surface, we've had election after election that's decided by these narrow margins, and then almost immediately power flips to the other side in the next election. That is true. But if you look underneath the surface, you also see this transformation of the party coalitions that we talked about, the Brahmin left and the populist right. So what we've had is a kind of realignment of the coalitions without new majorities. And in the past, you've normally had both. You've had the coalitions change shape, and you get one durable majority that comes out of it. So realignment, that sort of the motivating question again was, all right, how come no one can get these durable majorities? Left Adrift is more focused on that change that's taking place underneath the hood. So that would be the sort of point where I differentiate myself from them. And I will say, is this something where I just think that they are not giving the popular side enough credit? And this also goes to the question of culture wars, economic issues, and all the rest. If you listen to David Shor and David Plouffe, these are data nerds on the Democratic side, they don't say that we lost because of trans stuff. They say we lost because of pocketbook issues. They say, and it's really fascinating, Shor and Plouffe, they'll say, the Kamala Harris, the they, them ad, it wasn't great. It didn't help our side, but it was not their best attack. Their best attack was Joe Biden presided over this disastrous increase in prices, and Donald Trump, through science or magic, is going to make things go back to 2018, which is what you want. And they, and Shor in particular, someone who has this sort of lefty background rattling in his past, somewhere, at least broadly speaking, he says, this economic populism, this is the strongest card that we have to play. So economic populism of a kind, it works. And if you look at the ads that they were producing for Harris in the weeks leading up to the election, they were basically running her as Bernie Sanders. It's insert blue collar person here talking about how Kamala Harris cares about working people and is going to fight for you. And the problem they ran into is that was just a message that didn't cut, that you could drop $1 billion in the last month before an election, and because of hangover from the Biden years, because because of how people saw Harris's past, because she had a muddled economic message that she wasn't driving consistently, people didn't buy it. And my argument to the popularist folks is, if you agree with me that there's real juice in the economic populism story, then you just can't count on ads to get the job done, that there needs to be this broad scale change in party perceptions. And you're probably going to get it the way that Trump did for Republicans, by having these bruising fights over what really matters. And that is, Donald Trump made it very clear that the Republican Party had changed by running against Ted Cruz.
What are the fights that really matter then in that case? Is it not it seems to me the cultural war stuff would be some of it. I mean, obviously there are profound differences within the Democratic Party about where you would go by saying, Pocketbook doesn't answer whether you're, more sympathetic to Silicon Valley because it's driving economic growth or something like that, or you're more pro-labor or something like that. There are those profound divisions. Where does the cultural stuff fit in for you?
I would say that there's someone who had, broadly speaking, the right instincts on this, although there are places to quibble. Bernie 2016. Where it was Bernie 2016 was like, I have these progressive cultural issues, but importantly, he was not progressive, for instance, on something like reparations, because he recognized correctly that if you want to drive a wedge between the Democratic Party and white working class voters in particular, foregrounding that is like exactly what you would do. But he's like, he's broadly progressive on cultural issues, like obviously, like dude from Vermont, progressive and all the rest. But you knew that guy woke up every morning. What was the thing he wanted to do? Take on the millionaires and the billionaires. And that conveying that sense of priorities, this is the thing that matters, and driving that home again and again, and picking fights with people on the Democratic Party who don't have that perspective. And this, by the way, is something
but it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. So, okay, Bernie 2016, why did Bernie 2020 not have, I think the popularist center-left perspective on it is he capitulated too much to his young woke staffers or something like that. So he was not as effective. So in an environment of intense cultural politics, cultural polarization or something like that, it seemed like he couldn't split the difference. He couldn't do what would have been called for, and again, and this is my narrative, I don't want to sort of always project it onto somebody else. What would have been called for was Bernie actually taking a relatively unpopular stand. Now, it doesn't mean he'd have to pick public fights, but it essentially means he'd have to fire some staffers or tell them that if they could keep their job if they just sort of accepted his diktat on this or that they weren't going to abolish the police, they weren't going to do Black Lives Matter, they weren't going to platform, they weren't going to highlight the sort of pro-trans stuff in the same way. And that would have required more of a kind of oppositional stance within the Democratic politics of that moment than Bernie understandably wanted to take.
Yeah, I will say too, I want to get to Bernie 2020, but just in terms of what this strategy would look like today, if you go to Dan Osborne's website, so this populist independent candidate in Nebraska, go to his platform. This doesn't tell you everything, but it tells you something important, right? You look at how they present the platform. This is what the people running the campaign think is their strongest hand. Where I stand, big, all caps, bold, red letters at the start, the billionaires who control Washington have built a billionaire economy. That is like the thing that they lead with. And that is bad. And then everything else, smaller font, black underneath. What else is there? Cut taxes for small business and middle class, secure border for a secure country, protecting Social Security, stand up for law enforcement, guarantee right to repair, support our veterans, run down the list. But that image of sort of the thing that we are here for. And this, by the way, I think that someone like Iglesias views, maybe not Osborne in particular, but the general anti-billionaire position as a kind of brain-dead leftism that's the left-wing counterpart to visceral anti-immigrant politics on the right. And I think he sees this as like a doom loop between a stupid right-wing culture war and a stupid left-wing class war. And he wants something that acknowledges like sort of the potency of an issue like immigration, the potency of this class politics, while carving out a more responsible, and he would probably say some politically effective middle ground. So he thinks that if we just going down this route, it's a doom loop of anti-immigrant and anti-billionaire demagoguery feeding off of each other. So that's 2026, where we are now. Going back to 2020, I would say in defense of the Bernie position, not just that it's like the woke staffers, although that's a piece of it, and I would have been one of those woke staffers in 2020 as well if I'd been lucky enough to be involved in the campaign, but that there was also, and at least to me, a plausible case for a broad foregrounding of issues like, for instance, racial justice, when the big obstacle to Bernie winning in 2016 was his performance with especially older Black voters. And that if Bernie had done just not that much better, but like better enough with Black voters in South Carolina, maybe history turns out completely differently. And that it wasn't just we've got to move with wins in the party, but that if we want to improve our turnout with Black voters, that we will try and meet them on those issues. And it just turned out that that was not what they were looking for. It didn't work. And that he ended up in this sour spot where he still had, especially those like young millennial, upwardly, not so much upwardly mobile, but like a downwardly mobile millennial college grad that was sort of like pure Bernie in 2020. But he didn't gain meaningfully with especially Black voters in the South. And he ended up losing ground with a lot of those more culturally moderate economic populists who, for instance, are the reason why he trounced Hillary Clinton in West Virginia in 2016, 8 years after Hillary had done the same thing to Obama in the same state.
Well, I guess, I mean, I'm pushing on this, I think, because... Hey, so this is the free teaser. If you want to hear the whole thing, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe, at least for this month, and send some moolah my way.